For as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a teacher. My mom says she never worried about sending me off for my first day of school. I was always a pretty sociable kid. But she was taken aback by how much I enjoyed it. Other kids were having a tough time of being away from their moms, but all I would talk about was school, school, school. It got to the point where I asked my mom to buy me a little whiteboard so I could line up my stuffed animals and play at being a teacher. I was obsessed, so it was probably of little surprise to anyone that I ended up going to college and getting a degree in elementary education and child development. I was never under any illusions that it would be easy. Some people cite the long holidays when they say that teaching elementary is easy, but let me assure you, we earn those summers off. The emotional rigors of being what's basically a second family for hundreds of kids can really wear you down sometimes. It's rewarding in the extreme, but you see the very best and worst of humanity in these kids, and that can be tough. But all of those everyday struggles paled in comparison with an incident that occurred on a field trip in 2007, one that almost had me giving up altogether on a career in education. So at the end of last semester, our principal announced that we'd be taking our 5th graders on a field trip to the city's planetarium. And since I was a 5th grade teacher, I'd be tasked with being a chaperone. On the bus out to the planetarium, I was sat in front of 2 5th grade girls from another class. I ended up making some small talk with them when I noticed how one girl was wearing a particularly fancy bracelet. I complimented her on it, and she told me that it was a gift from her dad and that it glowed in the dark. I told her it was awful nice of him to get her a gift like that, and she agreed, but followed up by saying, "I just wish I could visit him more." She didn't say it in a sad way, more like with a kind of childhood innocence, like the situation was perfectly normal that everyone's mommy and daddy lived apart. I quickly opted for a tactical subject change, focusing on how excited they were about the field trip and how it was basically going to be like being in a spaceship. I mean, I was genuinely excited about it too, so it wasn't like it was any emotional labor to act like it. We arrived at the planetarium, depart the bus, and slowly herd the kids through the facility. I'd visited the planetarium when I was a kid, and it was pretty cool, but the museum that ran the thing had obviously made a few upgrades since my visit. It looked incredible, and that was just the decor. The quality of the projection was something to behold, and I knew that when the lights were lowered, it would look even better. And boy, did it exceed my expectations. There was an audible gasp from all the kids when all the stars and planets began to appear on the planetarium's ceiling. It was truly hypnotic, but I did actually manage to tear my eyes away for a few seconds, and that's when I caught sight of something glowing from across the large circular room. It was the 5th grade girl's glow-in-the-dark bracelet, moving back and forth in this arc shape, I'm guessing from where she was pointing at stuff. I carry on watching the presentation, listening to all the celestial factoids, but every so often I keep looking back at the glowing bracelet. It was just too cute not to, and sort of distracting, I suppose. Then at one point, I see a sliver of actual light appear on the other side of the room, from where someone had entered the planetarium. No big deal, probably just a member of museum staff, right? I mean, they didn't interrupt the presentation, so it's not like the entrance caused any suspicion. But then, I see the glow-in-the-dark bracelet rise up real fast. I mean, in a way where you'd think the girl had jumped out of her seat or something. Then the bracelet basically floats around the walkway at the edge of the room before the door opens up again, giving me just a glimpse of someone walking out with a girl in her arms. Instantly, I jump up, finding the nearest side of the teacher before whispering, "Someone just took one of the kids," into her ear. I can't just announce it. I'd send the kids into a hysteria, but at the same time, if I'm not quick enough, this person is going to escape the museum with one of our students in their arms. I ran right out into the lobby, but there was no one carrying any kids, so I started frantically asking people if they'd seen anything matching that description, and again, nothing. I'm about ready to start hyperventilating by the time one of my colleagues joins me, assuring me they've already called the cops. We managed to get all the kids back to school safely without them getting wind of what had happened, and when I finally got a few moments away from them in the teacher's lounge, I burst into tears. I felt useless, My one job was to protect my kids, and I failed at it. And all because someone had been so brazen as just to walk into the planetarium and take a kid from right under our noses. It made me feel sick to think about, wondering if she was okay. Who'd be sick enough to do that? By the time I came to my interview with the cops, I was actually sick from how stressed I was. Most of their questions involved my brief sighting of the kidnapper as he exited the planetarium. But as it turned out, even if I had gotten a good look at him, it wouldn't have mattered. The guy had a ski mask on, and he intimidated museum security using a pistol he concealed in his jacket. Even if I'd managed to catch him, it probably wouldn't have done any good. I wasn't the girl's teacher either, so it wasn't like I could provide much of an insight in her home life either. Police were actually about to leave when I thought about something I hadn't mentioned so far, something almost insignificant. The cops already knew about the glow-in-the-dark bracelet, but I hadn't told them who'd given it to her. And right when I did, I had something of a light bulb moment. The kidnapper was the kid's dad. I mean, I didn't know that for sure, but the cops seemed willing to entertain my suggestion, because what if the father is sick of getting every other weekend custody and wants to take his daughter away from the mom? What if he hears about a trip to the planetarium and knows that being in a dark room presents a great opportunity to take his kid away without anyone really noticing? He'd be able to take his kid back in the middle of the day, and our mom wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. The only trouble was how to identify his daughter in a pitch-black room full of kids. The solution was frighteningly simple. Give her a piece of glow-in-the-dark jewelry to wear, and give it to her just a few days before, so she's still enamored with it come the day of the field trip. I basically just thought out loud for a minute or two, and when I finished, you should have seen the looks on those two cops' faces. I don't imagine it's very often that a simple witness statement yields such a lead, but I'm guessing they were grateful for it. Then, a few weeks later, what do we all find out? The kidnapper was none other than the girl's divorced dad. I was dead on the money. As the story goes, the cops got in touch with him again, accusing him of being the kidnapper. He stopped responding to their calls, then took his daughter on the run through several different states. It's a pretty messed up story, and the kid needed therapy for a while after. I'm just glad I got to be a part of bringing her home. It still knocked my confidence though, and for the longest time, I couldn't shake this imposter syndrome, feeling like I wasn't good enough to do my job. If I couldn't keep the kids safe, what was the point of me being there? All the quality education in the world isn't going to mean jack if you can't get your kids on the bus home safely at the end of every day. But as a good colleague of mine once said, I can't hold myself responsible for every bad thing that happens in the world, and I need to accept that I'm not all-powerful. All I can do is my best, and if I can get up in the morning and look myself in the mirror and not feel ashamed, I'm doing all right. And I've been doing all right ever since. Worst field trip I ever went on was a day that would also turn out to be one of the worst of my entire life. I went to high school in the North Shore of Staten Island, and round about that time in my junior year, I started getting mad into CSI. Not just oh cool, I like this TV show. I mean, I wanted to be one of those guys. That show taught me that being a total nerd could be kinda cool. Everyone I know that was into the show had this super glamorous idea of what being a forensic investigator entailed, and for the longest time, I really wanted a part of that. Which is why I jumped at the chance to join my high school's forensic science club. We didn't do anything all that cool at first, just played around with fingerprint powder and did some pretty fun but pretty basic chemistry experiments. But I didn't join for that. I joined because the teacher in charge of the club had promised a field trip to the country's coroner's office, which would include a tour of the morgue. I didn't even know they gave tours of morgues, but I figured they have to run some kind of recruitment-based PR, right? So on the day in question, we all load onto one of the school buses and head off to the coroner's office. We'd been warned that we were going to be seeing some pretty graphic stuff, and despite having already collected permission slips, the teacher wanted to give us one more chance to back out while we still had the chance. We all just sat there all smug and Personally, wild horses couldn't have dragged me off that bus. But if we had any idea of what we'd be seeing in that morgue, if a glimpse into a crystal ball had shown us how that day was going to go down, not a single person would have remained on that bus. I guarantee it. Anyway, we get to the morgue, and obviously we don't get to the good stuff right away. We go through the day-to-day routine of a mortuary worker, what it's like for those on the lowest rung of the ladder. Then things get more complicated, and we start getting to see some of the labs there, albeit through a toughened glass window, but I was still salivating over all their Gucci lab equipment. CSI made it look all high-tech for TV, but the real thing was somehow even more impressive, despite not being quite as glamorous. After the lab stuff, we took a quick lunch break in tandem with the mortuary team. The afternoon promised to bring all the more macabre stuff that the more ghoulish of us had been looking forward to, and you could definitely feel a few ripples of excitement running through us as we ate our pre-packed food. When we returned, the excitement was only ramped up when one of the staff gave us yet another warning concerning what we were about to see, because he was going to share some organ samples with us. From what I can remember, the way it works is this. Say you die in a pretty distinct way, like cancer attacks a specific organ. The medical examiner will sometimes remove this organ for preservation so they can continue to study the cause of death long after a person has been laid to rest. What that means is that the coroner has a storage space with literally hundreds of organ samples in it. I mean, it is wall-to-wall organs in there, some of which are in a pretty gnarly condition, and we were going to get a chance to look at every single one. At first, it was every bit as fascinating as I imagined it would be. Sure, it was morbid, and once or twice I had to remind myself that everything in there had once belonged to a living, breathing person. It also made me think how fragile we are as people, how there's so much that can go wrong with our bodies. Honestly, it's kind of a miracle we can even get out of bed in the morning. Then, right as I'm musing all that over, the gentle hum of whispering among the students was suddenly broken by a distinct, "Oh my God." It wasn't like a scream or a horrified OMG. It was more like a disgusted surprise, which is why I initially thought someone had just found a particularly gruesome specimen. But it was worse than that. Much, much worse. Another person yelled in disgust, only this time it really does sound horrified, and instantly I'm on my way to the source. Two girls are standing in front of a shelf full of specimens, staring in horror at one in particular. I couldn't quite make out which one, and the next thing I know, the girl who shouted this lets out the most blood-curdling scream and goes hurtling out of the room, followed by her friend. Before I can get a chance, other kids are crowding the area trying to work out which specimen had the girls freaked out. Slowly, they start to see it too, and the group starts buzzing with exclamations and chatter until our teacher demanded to know what was going on. The group goes silent before turning to look at our teacher. Then, as they slowly made space so the teacher could see what they were looking at, one of the kids pointed to the offending jar. It was a brain, just floating there in isopropyl or formalin or whatever they were using as a fluid preserve. It didn't look all that gross, freaky sure, but it didn't have any of the tumors or necrotic tissue that some of the others had. In fact, it actually looked relatively fresh compared to the others. But the issue wasn't so much the organ, but who it belonged to. See, the brain belonged to a kid who died in a car crash. The vehicle he was driving got plowed into an SUV coming the wrong way, and his little sister was in the car with him when it happened. She survived, thank God, but she had to watch her brother die, right in front of her eyes, before rescue could arrive to pull her out of the wreckage. The medical examiner put the cause of death as blunt force impact wounds to the head, hence why his brain was of interest. But this kid wasn't just some random kid. This kid went to our high school. The girl who ran out had been a close friend of his, and the crash was only 2 months before the field trip. She was only just getting over his death, only just becoming able to get out and socialize again. The forensics field trip had been the first big thing she'd been excited about since her friend's death. And then she shows up and finds his brain in a jar. It It was like something out of a bad horror movie. I mean, people were just messed up. The girl who screamed went completely AWOL with her friend. I think her mom went to find her after talking with the teacher because the bus left without either of them. Everyone else was in a sorry state too. Most of the girls were crying. Heck, even some of the guys were too, kinda. I can't blame them though. It was an incredible thing to see. Incredibly terrifying, really. But it was knowing you can just end up as a brain on a shelf, a labeled specimen. That's what got me. I didn't really know the guy, but I knew he deserved better. Obviously, the incident caused a huge stink, and the kid's family said that they were even going to sue the county and school district. Rightfully so, if you asked me. But the trouble was, the guy was an organ donor. I mean, good for him for being unselfish about it, but that legally meant that after he was dead, his organs basically became property of the state. And at first, anyway, his family were told they weren't allowed to have their son's brain back. All they wanted to do was bury him again, and they had to get an emergency order signed by the governor or somebody so they could get him in one piece again. I can't imagine how horrible that must have been. Not one funeral for your dead son, but two. The family weren't done litigating, though. They wanted to get paid. I don't even think they really wanted the money either, or rather, they didn't need it. I just think they wanted to bleed the state government for what they did. I mean, they didn't even tell his parents that they were going to harvest his brain, let alone put it on display for high school kids to look at in less than 10 weeks after his death. It took them a while to get the case to court, and I remember being happy for them that they might get a little justice. But then word swept around town that they didn't get a dime. Some judge said that the state were well within their right to cut that kid's brain out. Like, I'm sure it wasn't phrased like that, but whoever had the balls to tell a kid's parents, "So what if we butchered your boy? Suck it up." There's a special place in the dark recesses of the afterlife for that guy. Oh boy. That court thing was only a few years back, and that's why it became the worst day of my life. Because it wasn't just finding the jar or seeing people's reactions to it. It was the fallout. It was knowing that poor kid's parents were reliving the torture of losing their kid over and over again for like a decade straight. And that's the real nightmare here, not just finding a brain in a jar. And knowing that just makes the world seem a little bleaker to me. Was there ever anyone in your town or neighborhood that your mom and dad warned you to stay away from? For a lot of people my age, there's almost always someone they were warned about during their childhood. For some, it's a neighbor or a certain person in town, and in some more sinister cases, it's a teacher, maybe even an uncle. But for me and the rest of the kids in our small Yorkshire town, it was John Cutter. Cutter, as we used to call him, was said to live in this old farmer's cottage a few miles out of town. We'd see him around town every so often, but he'd never talk to anyone, and that was a fixture in our town. Everybody rabbiting on to everyone else. A 5-minute journey to the shops for a pint of milk might well take a half an hour depending on who you met along the way. For that reason alone, going anywhere with my mom was a huge pain. She'd stop and talk to almost everyone we walked past. But not Cutter. Never ever Cutter. For years I really didn't think anything of it. But what I do remember is going into town one day to buy a football with my mom. As we were walking back down the high street, I disobeyed my mom and started dribbling it back to the car. At some point I lost control of it, and it ended up rolling down the high street and stopping just outside a pub. I ran to collect it, and by that point it was sitting right at the feet of none other than John Cutter. Can I have my ball back, please?" Cutter just stared at me, and then looked at the ball, then back at me, not saying a word. I remember thinking that he mustn't have heard me, so I asked him again. Immediately after, I feel my mom grab me by the arm and march me away. She drags me all the way back to the car park and starts telling me how I'm never, ever to talk to that man ever again. I didn't think I'd done anything wrong, but here Mom was telling me off worse than when I'd smashed the neighbor's window. The whole way home, I cried my bloody eyes out, but the message was loud and clear. Stay away from John Cutter. Then, around my teenage years, right when I was getting into that whole rebellious bugger off mom and dad phase, I ended up seeing where Cutter actually lived. It was an absolute mess, but that got me thinking that the reason no one liked Cutter was because he was just poor, a socially awkward and a bit scabby-looking fellow. I thought the same thing about the kid in the school other children used to bully, and I always felt just sorry for him. It wasn't his fault he had allergies and his nose was always runny and minging. And to me, the grown-ups in our town were doing exactly the same thing to Cutter. Not that I launched some campaign to change his image or anything. I just saw it as the oppressive conformist majority singling out and excluding someone who didn't live in the exact same way as them. Like I said, I didn't act on it. It just made me angry. So, in May of 1996, I'm 13 years old. I'm in my second year of secondary school, and it's almost the start of the summer holidays. I finished school on Friday afternoon, and as I'm making the short walk home, I notice there's an unusual amount of people and cars out on the streets at a time when it was normally just us school kids. So I've already got this sense that something isn't quite right as I hop the back gate of my house and walk round to the kitchen. Stepping inside, I'm greeted by the sight of my mom sat at our kitchen table. She's on the phone with someone, a box of Kleenex with a few used tissues around, and it's evident that she's been crying. I asked if she's all right. She hangs up the phone, then tells me something terrible has happened. Every year, once the weather turned nice, the local primary school would take its year 6s, that's 5th graders to you Americans, down to an old abbey not far from town. It's one of the oldest in the entire British Isles, so it's a huge tourist trap, and it's a big source of pride for the people around town. I'd taken part in the trip when I was that age too. Not most kids' idea of fun, but there were definitely worse school trips to go on. That Friday had been that year's year 6 turn to go down to the Abbey. About 50 10 and 11-year-olds were bussed down there in the late morning, and one didn't come back. Her name was Jenny Campbell. She was 10 years old, and the entire town went into a frenzy trying to find her. That's why the streets were so busy. Word had gotten around fast, and people had just headed down to the Abbey in their droves to help in the search. When the sun started going down, my dad and uncle ended up going down too with torches and whistles. I went to bed hoping poor Jenny would be found, at least so everything could go back to normal. But by the next morning, things only got worse. Overnight, a volunteer rescue worker had found Jenny's coat in some woodland not too far from the Abbey. Police were appealing for witnesses to come forward, scouring the area around the Abbey with dogs. It was like a blue and yellow circus had come to town, honestly. Police cars of all different sizes were driving through town all day, and a load of them were basically camped outside of Jenny's parents' house. But they didn't find her the next day, or the next, and after she'd been missing for a full week, I think people started to assume the worst. Less and less police seemed to be hanging around town, and people were definitely talking about it much less. Not so much because they weren't thinking about it, but because the idea of little Jenny not coming back was just too much to bear. I understood it was a really serious thing, but being the daft 13-year-old that I was, all I could give a toss about was the fact that I hadn't been allowed to play out for an entire week. Not long, I know, but to a kid that seems like forever. So when my mom and dad finally relaxed enough to let me play out with my mates, we had an absolute field day with it. What followed was basically Stand By Me, but if it was set in 90s Yorkshire, although I feel like I should assure you from the get-go that there were no close calls with train bridges and no one found any dead bodies. For obvious reasons, my mom had forbidden us from going down to the Abbey. But tell a teenage boy he can't go somewhere, that's just basically planting a seed right there. And as soon as one of my mates suggested that we go look for Jenny, that was all it took for us to march on the Abbey. For me, it was when a mate of mine said, "What if we find her, just at the last minute, and we save her from dying? We'd be heroes, boys. Heroes." And you know what? He was right. I couldn't understand why people hadn't found her yet, how the police could just appear to stop looking when a little girl went missing. So, off we went looking for Jenny Campbell, and for our sins, we found her. Right when we reach the forest near the abbey, I tell the boys to hold their horses for a minute while I run off for a wee. After I'm done, I hear two people walking through the trees, only from the opposite direction my mates are. Two thoughts go through my head. One, what horrible prank have they got planned since they're sneaking up behind me, obviously, while I'm half done? And two, how in God's name have they managed to sneak around and approach from a totally different direction? I do my pants up and turn around, already in the middle of saying, "What kind of bloody woofdas are you, sneaking up on me while I'm having a..." But when I see who it is, I'm stunned into silence. It was Cutter, and he's holding the hand of a little girl who looked exactly like Jenny Campbell. John Cutter, the local pariah, the one people made nasty rumors about, he was about to be a hero. "Cutter, you found her." It was the first and last thing I ever said to him. Not quite loud enough to alert my mates apparently, but loud enough for him to hear. He hadn't actually seen me until I spoke, and when I did, he and Jenny stopped and turned to look at me. It was only then that I noticed how Jenny didn't seem very happy to be rescued. She looked exhausted, pale and terrified, with cuts and bruises all over her arms and legs. Maybe she was just too shaken up to feel celebratory just yet. If she'd been out there for a week on her own, there's no telling what she'd had to do to survive. Then, Cutter spoke in a low voice, addressing me by name. I have no idea how he knew what my name was, and I was stunned into silence for the rest of what he said, and I'm guessing you'll see why. It was a long time ago, so this might not be exactly what he said, but it's the gist of it. "You're Johnny, aren't you?" he said. I just nodded. "And you live on that cul-de-sac near Dodd's farm, don't you?" Again, I just nodded, noticing that he was holding Jenny's wrist a little bit too tight. "And your mom, she works in town, doesn't she? In that little charity shop, all alone in the daytime?" I just nodded. I didn't really know what he was getting at, but it was certainly having its intended effect. "You going to tell everyone I found the girl?" he told me. Because I did. Didn't I, Jenny? Jenny just flinched when Cutter said her name, and he had to repeat himself to get a response which amounted to nothing more than a whimper. "Jenny's been lost, you see. Silly little thing wandered off on that school trip, and she'd been sleeping in the woods all on her own, all week. Isn't that right, Jenny?" "Yeah," Jenny said, and the way her eyes fell made me think that wasn't quite the truth. "So if you're gonna say anything else, little lad, whose mom works all alone in that quiet little charity shop, if you're gonna go telling something different, that'd be a lie, wouldn't it? And if you were to go telling lies about me, that'd make me very, very angry." Cutter continued to just stare me out until I nodded my head and murmured in agreement. "Good boy. No excuses. This little girl had missed her mommy and daddy very much, and I think she'd like to see them." And with that, he walked off, leading Jenny by that unusually tight-looking grip. I wandered back to my mates, who promptly asked me what had taken so long. When I told them, I wasn't all that surprised that they didn't believe me, not first anyway. But when I gave them this attitude of, "You just wait and see, don't take my word for it," and they saw I wasn't lying. "So, Cutter found Jenny Campbell? Who'd have guessed?" one of my mates said. "I guess he's gonna be the hero now then, isn't he?" The three of them started going back and forth about how he deserved it after all. If he'd been the one to actually find her, that definitely deserved some credit, didn't it? It took me a minute or two to actually find the words to say it, like you have to understand how conflicted I was. Shut up and let him take the credit, and I'd get the biggest "I told you so" moment over my family. Speak up, and I'd be defending someone genuinely evil. But I had to. What other choice did I have? I had this strong sense of morality. I couldn't possibly back someone I thought was guilty of God knows what. Guys, I remember saying, I don't think Cutter found her. Well, who did? I think... There were a lot of words I could have used, a lot of ways I could have phrased it. I opted for the one that kept my delicate sensibilities intact. I think Cutter took Jenny Campbell. I then had to explain to them exactly what he'd said to me, but with added emphasis on the way he said it. I might have been young, but I wasn't stupid. Something was wrong, but it wasn't like I was in a position to say anything. If he was psycho enough to take a little girl like that, he was psycho enough to hurt me or my mom to keep us quiet. But then again, if I didn't say anything, he might go on to hurt someone else. The census was clear. Go to the police as soon as possible, tell them everything, and then get whatever protection me and my family might require. But I'm ashamed to say that when I got home, I just completely bottled it. I'd have to start the whole thing off by admitting to Mom that I disobeyed her, and then I'd be following it up with accusing the bloke who rescued Jenny Campbell of being something I can't even say here. I got it into my head that it'd look like I was trying to make excuses for myself by making what was the worst accusation possible. It wasn't looking good for me, so I bottled it up inside. I just went upstairs, tried to take my mind off it, and failed miserably in the attempt. On top of that, I could barely sleep. I mean, could you if you were faced with that kind of dilemma? So that night, about 1 a.m, I sneak out of bed and grab a cigarette from my little stash of them under my bed. I open up my window and sit, actually quite dangerous now that I think about it, right on the edge so my room doesn't end up smelling of smoke. Needless to say, the nicotine didn't really help with the stress, but I was feeling moody and angsty, so it suited the aesthetic, I suppose. Then right as I'm smoking, someone walks underneath the streetlight just down the road, someone who looked creepily familiar. But I'm thinking, it can't be him. It really can't be him. But it was. It was Cutter, and he walked right past our driveway and looked right up at me as he did. I was only leaning out the window for like 5 minutes tops, and I don't believe in coincidences, so I'd be willing to bet it wasn't the first time he'd walked by my house. I was so scared that I almost fell out of the window trying to clamber back inside before he saw me, but it was no use. He knew where I lived. I was relying on Jenny Campbell telling whatever truth there was to be told, but when word actually did get around that he was the hero that found her, I found it more and more difficult to speak up about what I'd seen, or rather, what I suspected had happened. They didn't exactly throw him a parade or anything, but there was a story about it in the local paper, and a mention on a regional nightly news channel. The hype came and went in about a week or two, and although Cutter didn't get any more social after the fact, people's attitudes around him definitely changed. Then that was it. For years, the story remained the same, and neither me nor Jenny had anything else to say about it. At least until Cutter died, and then it all came out. I could probably write a whole nother report about how the whole thing happened, but let's just say it was ugly. Really bloody ugly. A lot of shouting and screaming, a lot of tears, and a whole bunch of regret. A lot of people told me I should have done things that I'm not sure they'd have done, if they were in my position at least. That was probably the most frustrating part, trying to explain to my mom that I kept my mouth shut about it, for her. And I suppose that brings us to the moral of what happened to me, or rather mainly to Jenny, and to the whole reason I wrote this up in the first place. It's always, always better to tell the truth and face the consequences of something than to keep your mouth shut. My dad explained it like a bank account. You put the truth in a box and hide it away, only it will accrue interest for as long as it's hidden, until one day you let that truth out, and it's bigger and badder and more hurtful than it ever could have been otherwise. His way of explaining it summed things up perfectly, and if I could go back and do things different, I would. I'd be much, much braver and just tell the truth, so that we'd all feel that some semblance of justice was done. Back when I was still studying leisure and tourism in community college, the department was allocated an annual budget that was supposed to pay for 3 field trips throughout the course of the year. The idea was that it was just enough to pay for transport and lunch on a trip to the Liberty Bell or Eastern State Penitentiary or something like that. But our tutor had a better idea. Instead of 3 boring field trips, we'd splurge the money on just one really awesome one. And what better way of learning how to help others have fun than to have fun ourselves? So after some discussion, we decided on whitewater rafting. The idea of paintballing had been thrown around, and I'd be lying if I said that wasn't my preferred option. But not all of the class liked the idea of shooting each other for an afternoon, and the rafting also involved a high-wire rope course and rappelling, so we compromised. The high-wire course was kind of scary, but it was definitely a rush, and the rappelling was incredibly cool. We felt like Navy SEALs edging down that big wooden wall. But then when it came to the rafting, the thing that I actually looked forward to the most, it didn't go exactly as planned. So, the plan was we'd all be separated into 4 groups, with 5 people per raft. Only one raft at a time could make it down the river safely, so there was like a little staging area near the river where we all waited. I was due to be on the 3rd raft down, and when the first group came back saying how dope it was, I was super stoked to get going. All in all, the run took maybe 15 to 20 minutes, so after the second group set off, I kept checking my watch so I had an idea of when they'd be back. 20 minutes go by, nothing. 30 minutes go by, still no sign of them. Then just as I'm about to ask the instructor if something was wrong, he gets a call on his radio, bolts to his 4x4 and speeds off. The last 2 groups are left standing there like, okay? And the general feeling that something bad had happened just started rippling through the group. Another 20 minutes or so goes by, and by this time, we're convinced something had gone wrong with the second raft. The 4-wheelers return, apparently with the raft's occupants, but there are only 4 of them, and those that are there are crying or seem seriously shaken up. That's when we knew we were right, and that it wasn't just a case of the raft getting stuck on some rocks. Someone was hurt, and they were hurt bad. But just how hurt, I couldn't have imagined. People kept asking if 911 had been called, if an ambulance had been called, where Sarah actually was. That was her name. And the whole time the instructor is saying, "We're doing all we can. I'm just so sorry." So I kind of figured that she was hurt, but that she'd be okay, you know? That, sure, it was scary, but it wasn't permanent, obviously. But it was. Sarah had fallen out of the raft and apparently just got face first into a rock or something. She knocked herself out stone cold and was laying face down in the water for a long, long time before anyone could pull her out. They tried CPR at the scene, tried to get the water out of her lungs, but it wasn't like the movies. She didn't cough the water up at the last minute, and there were no tears of relief as the credits rolled. Sarah didn't wake up. We all went to her funeral, but not everyone returned to the L&T class after that. Of the 4 other people that had been with her on the raft, 3 of them quit community college altogether. I don't really blame them either. I can't even really imagine how traumatic it was. Like they had to hang around for hours afterwards until the cops could come take statements from everyone, and that amounted to sitting in a freezing cold wetsuit in the dark. For me, just seeing the old college building reminds me of Sarah, so I can't imagine how it must stir things up in the people that watched her die. I suppose the only silver lining is that I definitely feel a lot more gratitude now for the things I have, knowing that life is such a fragile thing, and how at almost any moment, it can be taken away. Back when my daughter was just 11 years old, I got a call from one of her teachers while I was at work. It was the first time I'd ever gotten a call from them, as my wife dealt with all the school stuff while I focused on my building firm. So when the teacher mentioned something about my daughter being on a school trip, I had to interrupt her to tell her I barely knew anything about it. I know that seems rude, but I was in the middle of dealing with a customer, and time is money, as they say. The teacher then tells me that my wife isn't answering her phone, but that something very, very serious has happened. Like she'd already mentioned, my daughter had gone on a field trip that morning with the rest of her year's group. She'd been accounted for in the morning, but following another roll call after their lunch break, she was nowhere to be found. Obviously, I'm already furiously anxious at that point, but I'm managing to keep it together, right up until I ask where my daughter is lost. Nosleep Safari Park, the teacher responded. I literally couldn't believe my ears. Like I actually had to ask her again just to be sure of what she'd said. When she confirmed it, my legs turned to jelly. Nosleep Safari Park has all kinds of wild animals that can just wander right up to cars. If my daughter had somehow just gotten up out of her seat whilst inside the safari park, there's no telling what kind of danger she was in. It was honestly one of the worst days of my life. All I could think about was getting the call that they'd found her body and the closed casket funeral she'd have to receive. It'd be in the papers, no doubt. Every parent's worst nightmare, I'd say. A national scandal, they'd make the grieving process infinitely more painful. Obviously, I got in touch with my wife about it before her teachers managed to, actually, and she was every bit as distraught as you can imagine. Of all the places for your kid to get lost, a place where lions are allowed to roam freely on some old country estate or something. The wife was in work at the time and was so upset that she was sent home. She called up our daughter's school just to make sure she wasn't there, but there was no sign of her. Obviously, they'd pretty much confirmed in our heads that she was gone, and we'd be the next set of parents to be crying on the nightly news, begging people to come forward. I was just numb with terror, and even with all my workaholic tendencies, I couldn't find my focus. So I decided to drive home and meet my wife at the house to make sure she wasn't too hysterical. She really had taken it badly on the phone, and I was almost as worried about her as I was my daughter. Then, as I'm driving home, I see my phone in the driver's seat next to me start lighting up and buzzing. This is before I had a car with a Bluetooth stereo, and there was a police car like 3 cars behind, so I didn't fancy getting pulled over in the middle of getting the worst news of my life. The wife kept calling too, over and over again, and I just had this horrible sinking feeling that she'd gotten the word that our worst fears had been realized. So again, I keep it together, focusing on getting home in one piece, but then I pulled into our driveway, and I see that the door to our house is slightly ajar. I don't know what it was about that little indicator, but it put the fear of God into me. Was my wife so upset she hadn't shut the door? Had the police just walked in after telling her our daughter was dead? It all sounds quite irrational, I know, but I was in a terrible state at the time, and that's all I could put it down to. So instead of actually getting out the car and going inside to check on her, I called the wife from my driver's seat. I felt like a condemned man being walked the gallows as I waited for her to answer, and when she did, she was floods of tears. I mean floods. And I knew the worst had come. I just needed to hear her say it. But instead, all she said was, "She's here. She's at home. And thank God she's fine." I practically fell out of the car seat and bolted into the house. There, in the living room, are my wife and my daughter, both with tear-stained cheeks. And I'll tell you what, I'd be lying if I said my eyes didn't get a bit leaky in the moments that followed. Now, I bet you're all wondering what exactly happened and how she ended up back at home, and not at school or at the safari park. So, my daughter had just started secondary school here in the UK, and the safari park trip was supposed to be something of a social occasion in which kids could get to know each other while setting a positive atmosphere for the year ahead. But as it turned out, after the morning registration, my daughter and her friends had something of a falling out, and right before they were due to get on the coach, someone said something very mean to her. So instead of following her friends onto the coach, our daughter just slipped away without anyone noticing. She said she spent about half an hour or so in the library, but was so upset that she decided to just walk home. Having known about the spare back door key we keep under a plant pot in the backyard, she was able to let herself into the house. Then right about the same time she's making herself beans on toast to cheer herself up, her teachers do their second head count of the day, and that's when the whole saga kicked off. It was most definitely one of the worst experiences of my entire life. I know she was okay in the end, but I can't understate the terror you feel as a parent, knowing your child is either missing or in danger. I mean, it's completely irrational. I'd like to think I'm quite a patient and understanding person. You have to be in the building trade. But the teacher told me my daughter was lost. I actually wanted to murder her. So the worst field trip I ever had was the one where a classmate decided to shoot at us with a bow and arrow. He hit a close friend of mine and they almost died. Kid was a huge loner, but not in the way that made you feel sorry for him because he was being bullied or whatever. Like he was just a legit jerk. He didn't have friends because he was just horrible to everyone. As well as being a whole year older than us, I think he had friends around his neighborhood, so he never showed any interest in making friends at school. He always used to make jokes about how he'd be the next big school shooter and how we were going to help him get famous off of it. But we mostly just thought he was all bluster. I mean, thank God he didn't opt for a gun in the end. It was just a spur-of-the-moment thing when we took some archery lessons on a field trip to a Native American reservation. He just turned, let go of the arrow, and set it right into my buddy's arm. It went so deep that it pierced his arm, then his torso, and almost pierced his lung. If it had, doctors said he probably would have died before EMTs could have got there in time. The other kid ended up getting arrested for attempted murder, but since he was like 15, I don't think he got any adult charges for it. You know, he's probably walking the streets right now, having basically gotten away with almost killing someone. And that, to me, is the really scary part of our justice system. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And I'm literally in your walls.